I suspect that many of us are familiar with the old adage, 3 strikes and you're out. So often in our world, we hear and see people that live by this very adage. And well, this mantra in life becomes, I may forgive you once, maybe a second time, but the third time, forget it, you're out. And while this phrase might be applicable in the game of baseball, we recognize that in our lives as disciples of the Lord Jesus that this is inadequate for us. And we are reminded of that reality in our gospel this morning. Today we hear the third and final of the post-resurrection stories that are recorded in the Gospel of St. John. And in this third and final post-resurrection appearance, we hear Jesus speak a very radical message to Peter and to the apostles about how it is that they are to live the gift of forgiveness in their lives. Recall last Sunday when we heard about the tender compassion and gentleness that Jesus had with doubting Thomas, and how he helped Thomas to come to the realization that Jesus in fact was alive, risen from the dead. And with that gentleness and with that mercy, Thomas was able to make that great declaration of faith, my Lord and my God. Thomas was able to come to the fullness of the realization. And now today in our gospel, we hear Jesus teaching the apostles, especially Peter, another important lesson. In many ways, our gospel today could be described as the gospel of the rehabilitation of Peter. And Jesus gives to Peter and the apostles a very important commission of how it is that they are to accept, but also live the gift of forgiveness in their lives. Recall earlier in the gospel that as Jesus' earthly life was coming to an end, Peter was standing by a charcoal fire while Jesus was being whipped and persecuted by the chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees. And recall at that moment how Peter denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And now, days after this experience of Peter's denial of Jesus, we hear that Peter is also gathered around another charcoal fire, this time not with strangers, but with the resurrected Jesus himself. And as Peter is gathered that day with Jesus, he experiences something that is very different and something that is very life-giving. This time, instead of Peter being on the accusation side of things, he is on the side of receiving forgiveness and mercy. But it's interesting that in this third post-resurrection appearance of Jesus and this rehabilitation of Peter, that it is not Simon Peter that takes the first step in being able to seek this mercy and this forgiveness for his act of betrayal and denial. But in fact, it is Jesus that takes the first step, that Jesus is willing to move forward in the midst of all of this. And by doing so, Jesus set an example not only for Peter and the apostles then, but still for us today. Notice how tenderly and generously Jesus extends the gift of his forgiveness to Peter, freely and without reservation. Jesus, as he met Peter that day, could have alluded to the pain that he had because of Peter's denial just days ago, but he didn't. Jesus might have questioned Peter, asking, how, Peter, could you have done this? After all we've been through, after all that we've meant to one another, how could you say that you did not know me? But Jesus didn't. Jesus certainly could have been justified in saying to Peter that he had expected more from him, deserved more from him, but Jesus didn't. Jesus could have also dredged up all of the other times that Peter had failed, how he had missed the mark, how he had put his foot in his mouth, and yet Jesus didn't. Instead, what does Jesus do? Jesus extends with forgiveness that relationship. And not only does he forgive Peter for his denial, but moreover, he reinstates him in the mission of drawing others to follow him and to be able to live as disciples. And in doing so, we see that Peter's discipleship that day did not come to an end, but in fact, it becomes a new beginning. We heard at the end of the gospel, Jesus say to Peter once again, "Follow me." We know that 3 years earlier, at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he invited Peter and the apostles to follow him, and they certainly did for those 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. But now, as Jesus' earthly life and ministry is coming to an end, as he will soon ascend back to his Father in heaven, he invites Peter and the apostles again to follow him so that they could continue on with his ministry and his mission. And therefore, that day, Peter on the shore with Jesus by that charcoal fire learned that even his failures and his sinfulness were not a barrier for him from following the Lord and doing the work of ministry. This is why some 2,000 years later, our late Holy Father, St. John Paul the Great, would remind young people at World Youth Day in Toronto and 2002 those famous words, "We are more than the sum of our weaknesses and our failures. We are the sum of the Father's love." This is what Peter and the apostles experienced that day by the charcoal fire, that they were more than their failures and their sinfulness, but in fact they were the sum of the love of the Father and of Jesus. And with that love, they were given a second chance and a new beginning. And this is an important lesson for us to learn and relearn today for ourselves, that like Peter, there are moments in our lives of discipleship and faith that we too miss the mark, that we too stray from God's ways and God's love. But like Peter, we are also given that second chance and a new beginning, that we too are able to experience God's tender and generous mercy and his love. And so it is significant for us to reflect upon the dialogue between Jesus and Peter, that as they interact that day with one another, as Peter experiences this sense of being renewed, of being rehabilitated, and being reinstated, it is all based on love. Not only the love that Jesus has for Peter, but the love that Peter has also for Jesus. Notice that Jesus asks Peter not once, not twice, but 3 times that day, "Do you love me?" In many ways, Jesus was trying to erase Peter's denial by showing him that at the heart of who Peter was, he was a man of deep and abiding love, who in spite of his weaknesses and his failures, loved the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his mind, with all of his soul. And in doing so, Jesus was willing to give Peter and to give the apostles a second chance and a new beginning. And so too for us, that in the midst of our sinfulness and brokenness, that we too are being invited to be able to accept the love of God in our hearts and in our lives, and in turn to be able to express our great love to him for all that he is, for all that he has given to us. For we too are more than the sum of our weaknesses and our failures. We are the sum of the Father's love. And so this week, as we continue to celebrate the joy and the new life of the resurrection, let us allow the example of St. Peter and the new life that he has been given to inspire and strengthen us, that no matter what our past or present is, we can begin anew. And so today and every day, Jesus asks us, "Do you love me?"